So with this knock on the door, I open this academic ceremony in which Katherine Wisener will defend the academic thesis from incentive schemes to feedback processes on the challenges of recruiting, supporting and retaining clinical educators. So may I invite you to present the summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Prorector, dear members of the assessment committee, dear friends, family, and the audience on site and online, for the next 15 minutes, I'll give you a sense of my dissertation work. Thank you for joining. In 2017, I decided to do a PhD. 7 years, 2 children, 4 studies, 1 global pandemic later, here we are. I'm very happy to be here. To talk a little bit about what inspired this work, I work in faculty development in British Columbia, at the University of British Columbia. And in my work, I hear time and time again that the recruitment and retention of teachers in health professions education is challenging. Incentives can support motivations to teach. Incentives have been used to drive a variety of human behavior. Incentives have been used to try to promote voting, recycling, and other things. Unfortunately, incentives have also backfired at times, unintentionally worsening the problem. A common example of this is efforts to drive up blood donations by paying people to donate blood have lowered people's willingness to donate blood because the financial incentive undermines people's intrinsic desire to do a good deed. A little bit about our research context. This is a map of beautiful British Columbia. For scale, it's 23 times the size of the Netherlands. We have 1 medical student in British Columbia, and most medical student teaching is provided by clinical faculty who are health professionals first. They either take time off their clinical work to go to the university and deliver a lecture or a small group session, or they have learners come to join them in their practice. Clinical faculty receive very little compensation to teach. It's nothing compared to what they would otherwise be making clinically. And our studies specifically focused on, within the health professions education field, focused on the undergraduate medical education context. I wanted to know what the motivators and barriers are to teaching and how incentives influence those so we can better understand how incentives can support teachers in health professions education. My second research question is, in what ways can incentives create unintended consequences for teacher motivation? And thirdly, my research question is, how can health professions programs implement incentives in ways that meaningfully support teachers? So how can we do this well? Aside from the first paper, which was a critical literature review, we used an interpretive description methodology, which stems from the field of nursing, and it enables complex experiential questions to be asked with practical outcomes to be produced. As of a few weeks ago, all 4 of my studies have been published in health professions journals, and instead of going through each paper one by one, I'll be synthesizing all of my findings with each research question. So first, what are the motivators and barriers to teaching, and how do incentives influence them? We found there were a number of factors influencing decisions to teach. These factors could be personal, so things like enjoying teaching, supporting student development, paying it forward and repaying good teachers that teachers had themselves when they were learners, as well as building their own connections, their reputation, or keeping up to date with their clinical knowledge. There were also environmental factors, things like how learners impacted their patient care flow, whether they had physical space to accommodate learners, how much time teaching took, effects on their income, whether learners posed safety risks, whether they had choices to teach or not, and competing family demands. What we found was, instead of these factors being either motivators or barriers, was that they could be one or both, or depending on the person and the context, and even changing within the same person depending on their life stage. We found 3 different interactions between these factors and motivations to teach. The first is a very straightforward relationship, a linear relationship, where the greater the presence of a specific factor, the greater the motivation to teach. So, for example, the more a clinician enjoyed teaching, the more likely they were to teach. That was a linear relationship. We also found dual-edged factors that were sometimes motivating and sometimes demotivating. So a lot of clinicians talked about the privilege of teaching and passing their knowledge on to the next generation, whereas others talked about it being a begrudging obligation that they had to do to pay it forward. And the third relationship was a U-shaped relationship where the presence of a factor would increase motivation to a point and then cause a decline. For example, keeping up to date with one's own clinical knowledge was a motivator to teaching, but once clinicians felt they were too out of their realm in the subject area, they did not want to teach, and it posed a barrier. The effectiveness of incentives depended on how these factors were operating within individuals, which we'll dig into with the next research question. In what ways can incentives create unintended consequences for teacher motivation? In general, incentives were valued by teachers when they built on their recognition for their teaching efforts, appreciated their teaching, and supported their connectedness to their leadership, to the program, and to their students. However, we heard many stories of incentives that were delivered in impersonal, inequitable, inefficient, and poorly framed ways that caused harm to their motivations. For example, teachers talked about very generic thank you letters they received. No personalized name, a 2-line letter, clearly sent to a bulk number of people, that were offensive and not supportive to their motivations to teach, whereas letters that were very personal and spoke to the teacher's accomplishments were perceived of as meaningful. It was also at this point in my studies where teachers emphasized, yes, the leadership can do X, Y, and Z to make incentives meaningful, but what I really want to know is whether I had an impact on my learners. And this is where we began to explore learners' role in giving feedback to their teachers. So learner feedback is particularly incentivizing to teachers. And given a lot of the power dynamics having with learners giving feedback to teachers in person, learners often rely on student evaluations of teaching to give feedback for their teachers. Unfortunately, a lot of this feedback is generic, brief, it's delayed, it's anonymized, and teachers struggle gathering meaning from this feedback and applying it. When we talk to medical students, we learn that learners also have conflicting priorities that affect the quality of their feedback. They're worried about their self-image, but this extended to the point where they didn't even want to give positive feedback to the teachers because they didn't want to be perceived as overly sentimental. Learners are also worried about teacher retention and the impact on their teachers' feelings. They recognize they're busy clinicians. They don't know the power of their feedback at times and don't want their feedback to lead to the removal of a teacher or influencing the teacher's contract. And they also have to prioritize their well-being. Learners are being asked to give a lot of feedback, and it is cognitively difficult to come up with different feedback for every teacher they encounter. So they resort to oftentimes very brief and generic feedback for teachers that they might think were actually very well. How can health professions programs implement incentives and feedback in ways that meaningfully support teachers? When you look at this from a top-down perspective, it's important to align incentives with motivational drives. Some clinicians are driven to teach because they're intrinsically motivated to do it, while as others are teaching for an extrinsic motivation, and incentives will have a different impact depending on what's motivating the teacher. carefully crafted incentives is just as important as what incentive is decided, and delivery is important. And incentives that can promote connections between teachers and their learners, their peers, their leaders, and the program itself are more likely to be perceived as meaningful. From a bottom-up perspective, enabling meaningful feedback from learners to reach teachers, we need to be cautious when relying on student evaluations of teaching as a source of teacher feedback. We need to be mindful of learner fatigue and acknowledge that by prioritizing getting feedback for every single teacher, we might be sacrificing the quality of that feedback. And we need to orient learners how to provide feedback to their teachers, and we need to tell learners what happens to their feedback so that they know where their feedback is going and the impact that it will have. Implications of this work. The first implication is to broaden our conceptualization of the term incentives. The word incentives has somewhat behavioristic connotations to it. We talk a lot about the carrot or the stick, and human behavior is a lot more complex than that. So words like support, engagement, might be more appropriate to speak about what we're trying to do with clinical teachers. And motivations can be supported through appreciation efforts, not just from leadership, but through bottom-up mechanisms as well, and enabling learners to give meaningful feedback to teachers. The second implication is acknowledging this tension between intentions and impacts. So even well-intentioned incentives and learner feedback systems can demotivate teachers through ineffective delivery. So again, more so than what you decide to offer, how you deliver it is just as important. And even if the right incentive is chosen and delivered in the right way, this is still only half the battle. Hertzberg's two-factor theory reminds us that motivators and barriers have to be addressed in tandem, and barriers are often external to incentives and to the teacher. And supporting relatedness. Leaders, teachers, supervisors, learners, everyone we spoke to, all share concern over teacher recruitment. They all share concern over each other and their relationships, and these concerns influence their behavior. For example, learners were more willing to overcome their fatigue and write meaningful feedback to teachers when they felt that teachers cared about them. Educational leads and teacher supervisors made nuanced decisions of whether they let certain feedback reach teachers depending on their own relationship with the teacher and whether they thought the teacher could handle it. So relatedness should be fostered with our teachers as it is a critical component of feeling and expressing value. And relatedness comes from the self-determination theory as one of the main components driving up motivation. So final reflections from my perspective is that there's more that meets the eye with respect to teacher motivation in health professions education. It reminds me of a tree trunk where you see a tree, but when you look below, there's an intricate root system. Learners, teachers, leaders, and supervisors all play a role in teacher motivation. And I hope this work can contribute new understanding towards how programs can retain engaged faculty. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you for your very clear presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Joost de ten Brinke. He is a professor of learning and assessment at Maastricht University and secretary of this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, I read your thesis with great interest. It gave me new insights, including into the culture of education in Canada. And I was surprised that teaching is a voluntary activity, and yet there are still enough teachers. I think that's almost unthinkable here in the Netherlands. Teaching is part of the job, and there must be very good reasons not to do it here. So congratulations is also about the fact that your chapters have already been published. So that's a great part of your dissertation. I like to go into chapter 4. The model you present in chapter 4 of the tension between upward feedback goals and competing goals also gave me very nice new insights. And your research shows that there are many factors, as you also presented here, that make it difficult to achieve the upward feedback goals. And based on this, you suggest that the answer to your second research question is that learners deal with barriers to providing upward feedback in a goal-setting process. And in your discussion, you rightly say that we should therefore take this into account at the time of receiving rather superficial feedback of the students. I agree with that and I get that. And I think it's an important message. But more importantly, we need to invest in designing teacher to avoid or counteract these barriers you are mentioning, I think. And therefore you offer some nice design solutions. But I wonder, you mentioned several, what do you think is the most effective and why should that be an effective choice?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your comments and your question. Yes, it's important to note with that particular study, we had over 100 medical students volunteer to participate. That's never happened to me before in a research project. They had very strong and passionate feelings about giving feedback to their teachers. And they really do want to contribute to teacher engagement through their feedback. They're the first to recognize teacher recruitment issues. Sometimes they would withhold critical feedback because they didn't want their peers to lose that particular teacher in a particular specialty. So at times they made their feedback not as honest as they would have been. They also really are tired, and they essentially said that they will provide detailed feedback for the exceptionally good teachers or the really problematic ones. Mm-hmm. And the rest in the middle are most likely to get a 2-word line or something fairly generic, mostly because they're tired, especially as they enter their clerkship years. So I think it's really important that teacher assessment programs are not the sole source of feedback to teachers. We also need to have other sources of feedback to teachers that come from peers, that come from their supervisors, and that learner feedback is one part of it.
And how do we design that? What do we have to change in our programs to get those multi-source feedback?
I think it is worth examining how teachers receive feedback. In our institution, learner feedback is a large source of feedback to teachers. There are other sources as well, but we have to remember medical students aren't necessarily trained to give feedback. They might get a very brief orientation at the beginning of their year, but they have so much else going on, it's hard for them to really care about it until they're in the moment and having a problem. So I think it is worth just being cautious in relying on teacher assessments for teacher promotions, for teacher awards, and for feedback on teachers' performance.
Okay, and one of the solutions you also mentioned, also presented in your presentation, is that we have to invest in the relationship and the relatedness between the teacher and students. And I wonder, how does a very good teacher-student relationship look like? How far should that relation go? How strong should that relation be? And if it's too related, shouldn't that be not a problem that students again don't dare to provide feedback because they are too related to each other?
Right. Yes, that's a great point. It's always a fine balance. I think there are a few things teachers can do that don't cross that line. One very simple thing is teachers can ask learners in the moment for feedback on their teaching. Even just that question gave learners an entry point at times to have those discussions. Teachers can also model how to give feedback by giving it to learners themselves. That's a great way for learners to learn and observe how constructive feedback is provided. And teachers can also give examples of how they've applied feedback that they've received from learners in the past, just to convey to learners that their feedback is important, it is integrated, and that teachers are truly wanting it.
Okay. Yeah, and I liked the moderators you mentioned in your model. A total different question about chapter 2. In chapter 2, you analyze the problem of quitting teaching from 3 scientific perspectives, the psychology, the organizational behavior, and behavioral economics. And you indicate that you deliberately chose not to include literature on general education teachers, because research on motivating general education teachers is largely conceptual, redundant with research on medical educators, so you say in your thesis. But I was somewhat surprised by this, as I imagine that the literature on motivation to teacher might be similar, but that the literature on reasons for leaving teaching might actually be very informative, because when teachers in general education stop teaching, they leave their profession. And if medical educators stop teaching, they still are physicians in their profession. So I think there's a large difference, and although leaving is the other side of incentives to start teaching or to continue teaching, I wonder how you see this.
Yes, so I do remember reviewing the general education literature. I also remember in that particular paper we were specifically looking for concepts, theories, papers that spoke to the unique interaction between incentives and motivation. And if I recall correctly, that particular angle was not present in the general education literature. And the health professions field had already kind of taken what was relevant from that field and already had published on that. And that literature we had reviewed quite thoroughly. Mm-hmm. So,
and what do you think about looking at the other side? So leaving teaching?
Yes, I think looking at reasons why teachers leave most definitely could draw additional insights that weren't uncovered in that particular paper. I did interview teachers who had left their teaching roles, and it wasn't, again, each case was different, but I spoke to teachers that left because they were entering a later part of their career and they wanted to just get back to clinical practice. I talked to teachers who were asked to leave, or they had a very problematic situation and didn't think it was worth their effort. But I do agree that would be a great area to dig into, specifically around the teacher attrition and the reasons for that.
Yeah, maybe we can do that as a follow-up study.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The opposition will be continued by Professor Schele. He is a professor of health systems innovation education and online from the University of Amsterdam. Professor Schele.
Thank you, Mr. Director. Dear candidate, first of all, I would like to make some compliments to you and your brilliant team about the work you have done. You have made excellent studies and accordingly publications in very good journals. And I liked also the way you have done some transdisciplinary research involving psychologists and behavioral scientists and economic scientists, which I always find beautiful in a thesis to see this multi-perspective. And what I also like is very practical. But I would indeed like to discuss with you some issues that I found in your thesis. First of all, I was really interested in the interpretive description that you used. Got it from nursing, I understood, and it brings qualitative research to meaning and to practical solutions to be found. And but I was wondering a bit. Of course, in qualitative research, we try to follow rules from Lorelei Lingard, who says you have to write seductively, and well, we're really trying so. So, in this seductive writing, I always try to make sure that the studies are written like well, a summary of results from the qualitative analysis, and then give the reader some bit of explanation of the meaning, because otherwise it's difficult to read. And of course, I want to give them a present. And in the end, I try to give them some clues for practice, because my readership always is looking for it. And I was a bit wondering, was I doing also interpretive description without knowing it, or was it still the qualitative research methodology I thought I was doing? And so my question is what can you comment a bit on the difference between thematic analysis and the interpretive description?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and your comments. So I'm not surprised that you found similarities between interpretive description and other qualitative methodologies. There are a lot of similarities. For example, interpretive description does encourage a constant comparative analysis and a thematic analysis similar to grounded theory. It encourages using multiple sources of data similar to, and including participant observation, like ethnography. It also stems from the constructivist theoretical perspective and posits that multiple subjective realities are present and people are constructing their realities, and therefore any interview you're getting a sense of that person's particular reality, just like in phenomenology. So there are a lot of similarities with other qualitative methodologies. I think the distinction between others and interpretive description is that its purpose is to generate knowledge that can improve clinical practice, and by extension, health professions education practice. And so this mind for practical implications is always at the forefront throughout all stages of the research process, from who's on your research team. So when we did interviews with clinicians, we made sure to have a clinician on the research team. When we did a study with medical students, we made sure to have a medical student on the team. We had all investigators follow the role of the thoughtful educator, which is a concept that Sally Thorne emphasizes in interpretive description, where you're always thinking of how what you're uncovering can be applied in practice. So it's this emphasis on practice improvements that really distinguishes it. And we thought it was most appropriate, mostly because I work in faculty development and I was seeing this problem happen time and time again, where we're having troubles recruiting clinical teachers. Of course, some in more context than others. So it's really the practical and applied nature that made this the right methodology for our studies.
Okay, so if you teach qualitative research to a clinician like me, then the chance that I'm going to write interpretive description in my results and discussion might be relatively big, because I'm not a very theoretical person, and I'm always looking for this qualitative research helps me a lot to get more insight in what we're doing, and always looking for more or less practical stuff. So that seems that my kind of people, without knowing it, might end up in this interpretive description, if I understand well.
I would agree.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, so then that's what I learned. I'm gonna use this term more often in my methodology section. Thanks a lot. The next thing is that I have a very practical issue. I have been working as a gynecologist and as a professor in health systems innovation and education for a long time, and now at the end of my career I thought, let's do something different. I'm going to be the dean of dentistry, and I can tell you we have problems at this faculty. One of the big problems that we have is that the dentists that are teachers in our faculty get academically paid. That's completely different from what they get in practice. So let's say factor 2 or 3. So I was really reading your thesis and thinking, wow, thank you very much for writing this and doing this work, because I needed this knowledge. But I had some questions that I would like to discuss with you. And I was going into chapter 6 after going through your book, and I thought, well, thank you very much, because this is like a lesson and it will help me a lot. And what I understood is from your work is that if you would give incentives to these dentists, you're at big risk, because the fact that they work there for such low income means that they might be intrinsically motivated. Is that rightly understood?
Thanks for that question. I had a slide showing the different forms of motivation and the unique interactive incentives have. So it really depends. So from a psychology perspective, if you truly enjoy something, an incentive will undermine that. So a child who plays increasingly difficult piano songs and their parent starts giving them an ice cream every time they practice the piano, they will start playing the easy song just to get the ice cream. If you never introduce the ice cream, they might just continue progressing. So for sure, those who are truly passionate about teaching, really, they just enjoy the act of it. Implementing an incentive could harm that motivation, or at least crowd out the intrinsic drive to do it. When it comes to teaching, which is still work, there might be an extrinsic motivation part to it. And even within extrinsic motivation, there's different forms of it. You can teach to please your department head. You can teach, and on the other end of extrinsic motivation, you can teach because that's what it means to be a dentist or a doctor. That's just part of the job. So with that range of people, incentives do have a role, and incentives really should support, going back to the self-determination theory, should support autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And in our work, we really emphasize that relatedness component because the relationships were so important. When they're teaching, they want to be a part of something. They want to be a part of a program, so they want to feel connected to the program and their learners and their supervisors and their leaders.
Professor Schick, to ask you, Professor, I want to ask you to end your questions for the sake of time. I'm very enjoying this deliberation, but do you have a small question which can be answered in 1 minute? Or shall we go to the next one?
I can do the small question is, should I talk to every dentist separately as a person to find out the motivation, yes or no?
I have a lot of questions. I don't know how many dentists you have. I don't know how about your own engagement fatigue of your dentists. I think there are just some general rules when it comes to motivation and incentives, and offering a variety of things might be the best bet because then people can choose what's most meaningful to them.
So thank you for this outlook to dentistry, and the opposition will be continued by Professor Leslie. She is a professor of pediatrics at the University of Toronto. Professor Leslie.
Thank you, Prorector. Ms. Candidate, thanks for the opportunity to have reviewed your work, and I think it has so many implications for those of us who work as educators and faculty developers, so really looking forward to seeing how we're going to be reading and using your publications into the future. I had a couple of questions that really relate to areas that faculty developers are starting to pay more attention to. The first is this idea about how do we actually prepare learners to become teachers. So students as teachers, residents as teachers, we're starting to try to cultivate identities as teachers earlier in people's careers. And so I wonder how you might think a little bit about your work and how we might bring this work or the concepts around motivation and incentives to how we cultivate teacher identity in our learners as they move towards being clinical faculty teachers.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Yes, I agree. It's very important to cultivate that teacher identity early on, even within medical school. And I think a lot of medical students, you know, they're teaching their peers. When they become senior medical students, they're teaching their junior students. And residents are very heavily engaged in teaching. And I think it's really important to make that explicit, that is teaching. I think there is a big push to develop the identity of teachers. I didn't specifically focus on identity formation in my work, but I do note there's a lot of overlap between identity formation, development, and motivation theories. And really developing that teacher identity kind of targets that competence component in self-determination theory. There's autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And the more a clinician feels competent as a teacher, the more motivated they are to do it. And that is really important, I think. Even when I was recruiting participants for my study with clinicians, I had to be very careful to not ask to recruit teachers. I had to frame it differently. I had to frame it as, do you take learners? And then clinicians were more likely to participate in my study because they take learners, but they don't necessarily think of themselves as teachers. So I think that identity as a teacher really varies across clinicians, and the more we can build it, it's going to build that competence factor that's important to motivation to teaching.
Okay. Maybe as an extension to this kind of line of questioning, you found obviously across individuals, the role that incentives and motivations play clearly is quite different. And it didn't seem like there was necessarily any kind of pattern that you were able to see. I wonder whether or not, was there anything that you discovered, again, this idea over the course of somebody's career, because you did, some of your participants kind of were across different career stages. Do you see that there are some factors, kind of external factors, that might shift people's motivations and incentives as they progress in their career, that might somehow get captured in how we might be thinking about this?
It's a great question. And when I was conducting these interviews and looking at the data, I really wanted to see a pattern. You know, that's great when you can see a pattern, because then you feel like you found the answer. And I really didn't. So I spoke to, I think I mentioned one of my participants was approaching retirement and wanted to let go of teaching and just get back to basics. I remember he called it the lazy part of his career. He just wanted to focus on his patients. Whereas another participant who was approaching retirement did the complete opposite thing and said, I've done enough clinical practice, I've done this my whole career, I really want to ramp up teaching. And it was similarly different on the other scale. Like some of the new to practice clinicians I spoke to, you know, they have young families, they have a lot of debt, but they wanted to teach. I really thought they wouldn't want to just because of the impacts on their income, but they wanted to because they viewed it as building connections that could further their career down the line. Whereas other clinicians I spoke to that were early on in their career with young children just didn't have the capacity to even consider teaching at that time. So I think it really is a variety of things. And this is why I mentioned offering different motivations or different incentives so that people can choose what's most meaningful to them at that particular time. Some might want faculty development as an incentive because it gives them an opportunity to develop that teacher identity, learn more about teaching, connect with other teachers, and feel part of a community. Whereas other teachers might say, I can't commit any more evenings or my time to faculty development, but I really would appreciate being nominated for a teacher award and having my contributions be publicly recognized. So it really is not a one-size-all-fits approach, but the more you can offer your teachers, I think the more likely you are to offer something that's meaningful to them.
Okay, thank you. So separate line of question, again, another area that we're really kind of exploring and trying to pay attention to in faculty development is really how we really think about faculty development across the world, and how we really think about kind of different cultural contexts and different contextual factors that play into the teacher-learner relationship. And so I wonder, you know, when you're thinking a little bit about feedback and you're thinking, you know, your study really sort of shone light on some of those unique pieces around the relationships and how that influences learners' feedback and teachers receiving that feedback. I wonder, how do you think about this in a different cultural context, given that sometimes there are different power relationships for teachers, learners? Again, I think there was an example earlier on about kind of, you know, some cultures kind of require teachers to teach, you know, period, right? So I wonder how you think a little bit about how your work might actually be interpreted in other cultural contexts where teaching and learning relationships are constructed differently.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question and an area I'm really interested in learning more about myself. I think all my studies were situated in a Canadian undergraduate medical education context, and I think in every limitation section of every paper we acknowledge that these were explored in depth in one particular context, knowing that British Columbia itself is quite geographically vast and dispersed, so we did seek to capture a range of perspectives, talking to teachers, learners, and supervisors across the province. So some are working and learning in very large cities, some are very rural and remote. So we did capture all of those perspectives. But you're right, it is within one medical school, and so the payment structures are the same. The teacher assessment programs are the same, and of course, findings might vary within different contexts where payment structures might differ. So we didn't cover those contexts in our studies, but my opinion, just based on my work, is that they really would differ. Talking to colleagues in the United States, there's even more pressure to produce income through clinical work. And sometimes teaching is very explicitly not encouraged. And so these tensions are probably even stronger in the US than they are in Canada. And I would be very interested to learn how they differ in other cultural contexts as well around the world.
Maybe more specifically looking at, the chapter 4, where you really looked at kind of that, the role that feedback can play. And I think, you were looking, correct me if I'm wrong, around, there's feedback that's provided in a more anonymous way that teachers receive, where they don't necessarily know who the learner was. And then there's feedback that might be provided in the moment that might have more, might relate more to that relationship and that piece around the student-teacher relationship in the moment, or in a face-to-face way. I guess I'm just thinking, again, these are just questions that you might think about if you were going to be bringing your work to other cultural contexts. But I just wonder how the power differential between teachers and learners might look in different cultures. Obviously, we're familiar with what it's like in our North American culture, where there's a relatively small, I would argue, compared to maybe other cultures, power differential between teachers and learners. I just wonder how what you found around that relationship between learners and how that might influence feedback, how that might play out if power differentials were greater, even greater, between teachers and learners.
Yeah, I certainly acknowledge different cultures would have different sort of rules of engagement around a novice learner giving feedback to a senior teacher. So I do think these dynamics and tensions would vary across cultural environments. I would love to explore that in future work, most definitely.
So thank you, Professor Leslie.
Do I have?
No. The answer is no. You're quite on time. Thank you for your discussion, your lovely discussion, but I have to go to Dr. Beaver. She will continue the discussion, and she is an assistant professor and member of the Task Force of Faculty Development at Maastricht University.
Yes, thank you, Prorector. Dear candidates, first of all, I also would like to congratulate you and your team with this well-written and compelling and well-published dissertation. So it's a great piece of work. And I've read it with great interest, and not only once, but even twice when preparing the questions. And every time I learned something new, so this was really nice to me. But I also, of course, when reading your dissertation, I had some questions, and I'm looking forward to discuss with you. And my first question came up when I saw your cover of your dissertation, and I just learned that your husband designed that cover. And I also heard you mentioning in your presentation, well, that human behavior is much more complex than just a carrot on the stick. But I would like to hear your thoughts on this. Like, if there would be something like a carrot on a stick, what would that be? Would there be a different carrot for every teacher, and who is holding the stick? Could you maybe just share shortly your thoughts with me about the cover?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your comments and your question. I struggled a lot coming up with the concept for the cover, and if you heard the conversation between my husband and I, who wanted a clear concept that he could work with, I did dabble with the idea of a bunch of carrots, different sizes, different colors, and ultimately went with the simple metaphor that everyone recognizes, the carrot or the stick. I hear it probably once a month in meetings. Do we want a carrot or we want the stick? A couple years ago, I actually looked up where it came from, and I think it was originally used to get donkeys to move from one place to another. So it's a bit of a play on the carrot or stick line. And just as I ended saying there's more to meets the eye, so the cover is meant to be, I guess, a tease of sorts. Is it the carrot or the stick? But there's more to meets the eye if you look inside and read about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. Thank you. So there would be maybe different sized, colored carrots for different teachers.
And different vegetables, and maybe some cheese, and
yeah. No,
different
for sure.
options.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Well, then intrigued by that cover, I also read, of course, your chapters. And yeah, as you heard, I'm working at a task force for faculty development. And we encounter a practical problem here I would like to hear your advice on. So teachers in our university, they receive 16 educational hours for their own continuing professional development, so that they have to teach 16 hours less, and they can invest in their own development and think about what they would like to learn and improve on, work on their teacher identity, learn more about assessment, providing feedback to their learners, these kind of things. And we as a task force offer these kind of workshops or individual sessions or advice. But we also see that lots of teachers don't sign up or do not show up to these sessions, and these 16 hours seem to be like a reward, which is maybe not a reward, because in practice it's very hard. What does it mean? You don't get these hours, you don't have enough, even more time. So I was wondering, is this kind of rewards, is this a good idea? Should we continue with this? If we want to motivate our teachers to invest in their continuing professional development? Or are we, as you describe in one of your propositions, are we forcing our teachers to do more with less time? And what would be your advice for us on how to offer CPD and how to motivate teachers to engage in their professional development more regularly?
Thank you for that. That's an excellent question. And I think some teachers are motivated through faculty development opportunities. Some want that. And I work in faculty development as well, and I think many people who work in faculty development have this problem where people don't sign up for workshops, or the same people sign up for workshops and they're already really excellent teachers. So it's always a challenge to reach the majority of teachers through faculty development. As I mentioned, I think that the time crunch is a barrier for a lot of teachers, and clinicians in health professions are doing more with less. They're asked to learn new assessment systems. They are asked to provide accommodations for learners who are neurodiverse. They are asked to incorporate more EDI into their teaching, equity, diversity, and inclusion in their teaching. And teaching is not their main job. Their main job is to care for their patients. So we do need to be very careful on what we're asking our clinicians to do, including with respect to faculty development. I think that just from my own work experience and talking to participants, not necessarily what's covered in the book, is, but knowing that people are motivated by different things, is to consider other ways for faculty development to happen, whether that's within their practice settings so that they're not having to take time away to come to a workshop or to come to the institution, but bring faculty development to them. Yeah. Or since a lot of teachers are motivated by their relationships with their students, perhaps engaging some students in having these conversations with teachers about teaching, and framing it that way so that teachers are learning how to teach from the perspectives of their learners, which is why they're doing it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, thank you. So offering CPD more on the at the workplace than at the faculty separately, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, my opinion would be that might be a good opportunity, yes, to reach some more faculty.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just looking at the prorector. Do you have 1 minute? 1 minute question. Maybe just shortly in a different question. So in chapter 4, you explored learners' perspective on providing upward feedback, and you mentioned already that you recruited, or there were 100 participants interested but only 16 eventually then participated in the interviews. And how did you make that selection, and what might that have for an influence of your results?
Yeah, that's a very great question, and it was a very unique problem to have. Yeah. And it was a good problem to have, because then we had a lot of opportunity to select very differing perspectives. So we wanted to include junior learners and senior learners. So we spoke to learners across all 4 years of the medical school, across all 4 sites. Our medical school is distributed across 4 regional sites. So we talked to learners at all sites. We tried to get as diverse perspectives as possible, again, in line with the interpretive description methodology, to be able to generate knowledge that could be applied to the medical student body or different learner perspectives. So in actuality, it was a good problem to have, to be able to pick and choose different perspectives. And I think, and once we reached saturation, like we started hearing the same things, as similar perspectives were coming up, then we stopped our interviews and proceeded with the rest of the analysis stage. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I give the word back to the
Not satisfied. Thank you very much. So the opposition will be continued by Dr. Whittingham. She's an assistant professor and her area of research is health education, but she's also a program leader in the bachelor program. Dr. Whittingham.
Thank you very much, Prorector. Dear candidate, I would like to join the others in the compliments of you developing a very impressive piece of work, published work, so congratulations on that, and also on the team. Having read the first sentence of your thesis on the recruitment and retention of teachers in health professions education, then I knew I was at the right place. As someone who values the role of educators, particularly in clinical and health context, I knew I was at the right place. I read your thesis thus with great interest and intrinsic motivation, with a wink. As mentioned, one of the educational roles is to manage the Bachelor of Health Sciences at our university. To give you a little bit of an idea, that program has an intake of about 350 students each year, a large program in our view. That means a lot of teachers involved. I have to gather, or together with a team, to make sure that every year, academic year, there are many teachers ready to teach and get involved in our program. Not always easy. Clinical educators, as you mentioned, often face challenges. One of them balancing different responsibilities, duties, but also families and social life. And to combine that with teaching is not always easy. Before I continue, I would like for you to read out loud Proposition 11, please. Or your paranymph is also fine.
Hi. Do or do not. There is no try. Oh, number 11, just keep swimming. Dora.
Dory, indeed. A reference, thank you very much, a reference to the Finding Nemo movie. For those who haven't seen, there's Dory flapping around, pushing Nemo to swim by saying, just keep swimming. Which I can relate to, as I didn't know, but indeed I am a Dory with all the teachers. Just keep swimming, keep educating, keep doing what you're doing. But would like to be a little bit less of Dory. So my question to you is, based on your findings, I've read at the end of chapter 3, important incentives, for example, making teachers feel recognized, appreciated, develop meaningful teacher and learner relationships, carefully crafted, personal emails, that sort of things. What do you recommend me to do as a program manager and being involved with many teachers? What would your advice be for me?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your comment and questions. That proposition, I'm also a Dory. That was also actually in reference to myself throughout this PhD. Just keep swimming, and we'll get to this day. I would recommend, I acknowledge it's a lot of work to personally acknowledge every single teacher. I think at least in our medical school and a lot of medical schools, there are supervisors of teachers or educational leads. And those are really oftentimes the first person teachers would go to if there is a problem. And they have the relationships, they want to preserve the relationships, and I think possibly enacting them to help convey meaningful appreciation to the teachers would be important, because teachers look up to them, they're connected to them already. Those relationships are important to them, and appreciation from supervisors would be very meaningful. So possibly creating momentum within the supervisors on your team to help further your efforts to reach more teachers might be more efficient.
Okay. If I make that really practical, so I have a teachers meeting, to formulate personal thank yous, is emails, would you have any suggestions to make that practical? Because again, I can tell course coordinators, for example, to make compliments to, for example, their team members. Is that the sort of line I should be thinking about? Does that go further than that?
So I think we're talking about thank you letters. That's just one way to appreciate teachers.
Yeah.
There's also teaching awards.
Yeah.
There's also programs that can recognize the bulk of teachers through.
So after the bulk of teachers, how would you end your sentence? Just for the sake of the opponent.
There's a lot of different things you can do that don't just include personal emails to every teacher.
There you go. Katherine Wisener, the time allotted for your defense has already passed, as you noticed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense, and I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. All your time, 'cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Yes.
Please be seated.
Yeah, we know. Katherine Wisener. Hello. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. So Professor Driessen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I invite your supervisor to take the floor and first take the declaration of integrity.
Okay, like in Finding Nemo, we start with a vow, like Nemo did to his wife. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Katherine Marie Wisener, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Prorector, highly esteemed and esteemed colleagues, friends, family, paranymphs, thank you all for the time you invested today. That was a wonderful discussion, and I particularly appreciate how you challenged Katherine to enable her to really present the depth and breadth of her understanding and appreciation for this work. I can't call you dear candidate anymore, but dear Katherine, and let me be the first to officially recognize you as Dr. Wisener. I get the honor of the final word today on behalf of Eric Driessen and myself. And the charge was to tell people what it's truly like to work with you. So I promise there'll be no holds barred, and you're going to get the honest truth today. And I do that because you probably just can't know how impressed Eric and I are with what you were able to accomplish. At the start of your talk, you mentioned that you had 2 children during your degree. You mentioned that a global pandemic broke out. You could have also mentioned that you were Associate Director of the Office for Faculty Development in the largest medical school in Canada. You could have also mentioned that in that role, you routinely find yourself doing 2 or 3 jobs due to staff shortages. You could have also mentioned that you've been leading multiple national courses for physician groups over many years, and that you somehow, through it all, managed to keep up your running so that you're still doing ultramarathons very routinely. That's not a recipe for success in a PhD program. It's perhaps fitting, others won't know, but Katherine gave a practice talk 2 weeks ago, covered in bandages and bruises and cuts after a fall from her running training, and it seemed a little bit metaphorical for everything you had gone through over the course of the past few years. So absolutely amazing. Had I known that even 2 of those things were going to occur, I might have canceled you against doing a PhD. So just amazing you survived them all. And on top of those challenges, and I'll speak only for myself here, but Eric is very hard to work with. So it's just one more hurdle that you had to overcome. It's very wise that you decided to go to a brewery every time you had to meet with him face to face. I can't blame you for that in the least. And for all that, Dory came up, and that just keeps swimming line over and over today, and it's very fitting, perhaps a reflection of your training as a runner, that you just kept, if not one fin in front of the other, one foot in front of the other for years. And to try to figure out how many years it was, I actually went back to my email archive because I just had truly lost track. And don't know if you would know this, but the very first email I had where you actually outlined some of your initial thoughts for your PhD came on November 1st, 2016. So 8 years, really, from starting to think about this. As others have heard today, there was a period when you were popping out one child per paper. And so I really did start to wonder whether you were not going to complete or whether you were going to have a very large family. It wasn't at all clear why you had to be pregnant to write, but maybe that's also about motivation, and we need to take that into account with your future work. And for all of that, you're in the minority of PhD candidates that I've had the privilege of working with who successfully published every one of their papers before even getting to their defense. The quality of the work obviously makes that evident as why you're able to accomplish it, but what others won't have seen is how able you were to adapt your thinking, to change focus, to adjust your plan as new information came to light. And no surprise that you're, as a result, already being called to give invited presentations internationally. I don't know of any other better objective evidence that you're already having a tremendous impact, a tangible impact on health professional education. Just a couple of years ago, in fact, I started getting a variety of people who I only had tangential relationships with approaching me to compliment you on your work. Got a beautiful email from an editor-in-chief in our field, highlighting how your work had already started to be helpful and change the way that she was thinking about her own projects. Last summer, I found myself at a conference in England and was out at a conference dinner with the organizers and a variety of VIPs that they had invited. And one of them, a stranger who I'd never met before, rushed up to me, clearly excited to meet me. It made me puff out my chest a little bit as I waited to hear what he was going to say. And it turned out he was just trying to get through to you through me. So not only did I spend half an hour listening to him gush about your work and how impactful it has been, but he then would not let me forget about it because he followed up the next day with an email that said, as I explained, it's one of the only 3 research papers I reference in all my local and national discussions about recruiting and maintaining clinical teaching capacity in medical education. So yeah, he not only distracted me for dinner, but just had to make sure that there was a long-lasting record of just how impactful that you've been. More important than any of that, though, Dr. Wisener, is who you've proven yourself to be as a person. Nearly everyone else I know would have crumbled under that list of tripping hazards that I named. Not only did you just keep swimming, but you did it with a composure that's enviable. And actually never led me to believe that you were going to give up. So very impressive. You're a model student. Model feedback recipient. You made me feel as though I could be as blunt as the Dutch claim themselves to be. So I appreciate that you always kept your eye on the next horizon. Moved past those tripping hazards and kept moving forward. So I'm genuinely grateful for the chance to work with you. You've reminded me about how privileged we are to play this role. And I'll just finish by saying congratulations, welcome officially to the role of scholar, and thanks for who you are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Eva, for your words to really remember, I think. Dear Dr. Wisener, also on behalf of the Maastricht University and its College of Deans, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. And as a professor of general practice or family medicine, as you would say in Canada, I don't know. And involved in teaching, I took some points home to recap my faculty development courses. Before I close this academic sessions, I wanted to say that we have some refreshments in the rafter of this formerly cloister. And before that, we're going to do two more things. One is to take a picture with all these magnificent professors in the back, so in this room, and then we go to the stairs. So it's the full package. We go to the stairs, and then everyone gets on another picture. And I think we have a very professional photographer, and children, and husband. And with these words, I close this session.